Good morning, everyone. I am Randy Zubek, Deputy Chief Actuary here at CalPERS, and thank you for joining us today for a look at the new Pension Outlook tool. I have the easy part of today's webinar. I will just be introducing our speaker and then monitoring the questions and comments that you all have as we go through the slides. We will leave time at the end of the session to address questions that you have. I'll try to pick out the most common themes and the most important questions that are submitted. Also, I want to let everybody know that we will email you a copy of the presentation as well as the user manual by the end of this week. And before we begin, I want to let everybody know that even though, as you'll see from the presentation, the Pension Outlook tool will give you capabilities for modeling a lot of possible scenarios in the future and will give you a lot of valuable information, it is not intended to take the place of consultation with your CalPERS actuary. So keep in mind, even if you feel like you have all the information you need from the tool and completely understand what comes out of the tool, you should always contact your CalPERS actuary before making any significant decisions. So at this time, I want to introduce our speaker, Carrie Worgan. Carrie's one of our most experienced and knowledgeable actuaries here at CalPERS. Carrie noticed that there was a need for this tool. In working with our agencies around the state, he saw a need for this tool. He spent a lot of his personal time setting up an early version of the tool and presenting it to the executive team here at CalPERS. So I want to thank Carrie for all of his efforts. It's a great tool. I know you all are going to enjoy using it. And with that, I want to introduce Carrie to go through with our slides. Thank you.
Thank you, Randy. And good morning to our participants on this webinar called Charting the Path Forward, where we will be introducing CalPERS' new Pension Outlook tool for public agencies. My name is Carrie Worgan, and I'm a supervising pension actuary in the Actuarial Office, and I have the pleasure of doing this session. The Pension Outlook tool was recently made available for all non-pooled plans on My CalPERS. And I know many of you have been using the tool, so we look forward to your questions on this new application. This session will be broken down into the following sections. First, pension fundamentals. This is where we will cover the key funding measures at the valuation date. The path forward. This is where we will develop the possible positions of the pension plan as we move into the future beyond the valuation date. Third, the finance director view. This is where we will assess the key cost issues most cities, city managers, and finance directors are facing as they gaze into the future of their plans. The budget tool view. This is where we will review the information coming from the tool that will impact the agency's budgets. And finally, the question and answer section, where we will address any questions you have entered during this session and where to get additional information, as Randy mentioned, for example, the user manual. So let's start with the pension fundamentals. All agencies received their valuation reports at June 30th, 2018, last August, from the Actuarial Office assessing the financial position of their plans on that date. The main measure of the financial health of a pension plan on a specified date is called the funded status. What this means is if the funded status is less than 100%, then the pension obligations of the plan, known as the accrued liability or accrued liabilities, are greater than the market value of the plan assets set aside to pay those obligations. The funded status is thus determined as the ratio of the plan's assets to the plan's accrued liabilities on a specific date. The goal then is to get the funded status to 100%. On this slide, you can see the ranges of funded status, whereby a funded status of less than 60% would be in the red or danger zone. These plans are more at risk of not being able to deliver the promised benefits. Currently, there are not too many plans in this range at CalPERS. For most actuaries, the yellow or caution zone is a funded status of less than 80%. This is where we typically see most of the classic plans at CalPERS. These plans are monitored carefully to see that they are making progress to the long-term goal of 100%. Finally, the green or comfort zone is a funded status of more than 80 or 90%, with 80% being light green and 90% being dark green. These plans include some classic plans and almost all the PEPR plans, and they are considered well-funded and not at immediate risk of delivering the promised benefits. The second key fundamental is what we call the baseline. This represents the projection of the funded status and the required employer contribution rates as we move beyond the valuation date. So Pension Outlook takes the information for each plan at the most recent valuation date and then projects the funded status and employer rates going forward using the following: assumed investment returns, which are currently at 7% per year, the member demographics of your plan, reflecting benefit payments to your retired plan members, and accruals of benefits to your active members. We look at the specific provisions of your plan and the transition of active members from classic member status to PEPRA. And finally, the actual experience of your plan, which will be revealed in future valuation reports. Items such as the actual payroll increases, impact of disability retirements for safety plans, for example, overall mortality experience for all plans. These items altogether will determine the actual path forward for your plans as they are compared to the baseline forecast. So Outlook will project the baseline forecast for your plans over the next 10, 20, or 30 years. Accrued liabilities reflecting benefit payments and future accruals of benefits to your active members, whether they are classic or PEPRA. We project plan assets reflecting these benefit payments, plus employer and employee contributions and assumed investment income. The unfunded accrued liability, or UAL as it's known, is the difference between the accrued liabilities and the plan assets. 4 is the projection of your funded ratio, which is just the ratio of the plan assets divided by the accrued liabilities. And 5, and finally, is the projection of the required employer rates, which reflect the normal costs or annual accrual of benefits, plus the minimum required UAL payments needed to fully fund your plan under the CalPERS amortization policy. So my favorite analogy is that you are charting a long voyage at sea, and your baseline would be your direct path to your destination. But we know that there will be headwinds, tailwinds, and potential storms that will push your ship off its direct path. And you will have to continually adjust your ship back onto course to its final destination. So our baseline is that direct path. Pension Outlook will show you the range of results that are possible. So Outlook will also project these alternate scenarios and compare them to your baseline path. Key scenarios are the main driver of funding volatility is investment return, representing 80 to 90% of our experienced gains and losses. Outlook allows you to use random scenarios from our most recent asset liability management, or ALM workshop in November 2017, or you can enter your own investment forecast into the tool. You also have the ability to adjust the discount rate assumption if you believe that interest rates may be heading down in the near future. For agencies considering or have already made additional discretionary payments, or ADPs, Outlook will model these payments for you and their impact on your plan savings and future costs. As an aside, I would note that the Actuarial Office has also developed a more robust spreadsheet for modeling ADPs, and if you're interested in making additional payments, you should contact your plan actuary for your plan's copy of this spreadsheet. And fourth and finally is that Outlook has a budget tab that will provide projected costs and funded position of both the baseline and your chosen scenarios. Delving into that piece a little bit deeper, the budget tab on Outlook will assist finance directors with 1, projecting costs, plan costs under the baseline and alternate scenarios, 2, providing annual increases or decreases in funding requirements under these scenarios. They will be able to highlight the impact of ADPs on your budgets, or perhaps highlight the need for making suitable provision for significant cost increases through a Section 115 trust. And all of this information is downloadable into Excel for further analysis or to customize reporting to city managers or city councils. So when creating investment scenarios using Outlook, it's important to reflect reasonable expectations in the short term and long term, and to consider the impact of reversion to the mean. In looking at this table, you can see that in a one-year forecast with the current expected volatility of 11.4% in the PERF portfolio, we would expect a one standard deviation range of between negative 4.4% and 18%, which is a fairly wide range. This would cover approximately 67% of the likely outcomes in a year, meaning that there is a 16% probability of earning less than negative 4.4 and a 16% probability of earning more than 18% in any given year. However, if we were in a 5-year or 10-year projection period, we would expect a tightening of the reasonable ranges. This is due to the reversion to the mean typically exhibited by the equity markets. For example, we would expect for a 10-year projection period that 2/3 of the time we would be within 5% and 9% cumulative returns over that period. Another way to see the impact of this reversion to the mean on investment returns is to look at historical returns on the PERF over the recent past. This graphic shows us the actual monthly returns compared to the assumed investment returns over the last 9 years at CalPERS. The blue line is as if you put $100 into the PERF on July 1, 2011, and tracked its growth due to investment earnings on a monthly basis. The red line is the baseline growth on that $100, assuming we earned exactly the assumed investment return equal to the set discount rate. The green circles on this chart reflect the position on the annual valuation dates of June 30th. Now you will notice that the blue line snakes around the red line, never deviating too far above or too far below the red line. This mirrors the market returns. When the markets get too far overvalued or undervalued, corrections take place to bring it back towards fair value. The tracking error measure you see in the bottom right shows that over this period, on the positive side, returns have been 8.2% above our assumptions, while on the negative side, returns have been as low as 8.7% below our assumptions. Currently, we are tracking about 4% above our assumptions, which may imply a slight correction is on the horizon. Using Pension Outlook and adopting reasonable assumptions looking forward, we were able to produce this graph for our board showing the progress of the funded status of the pension system over the next 10 years. Under our baseline assumption of 7% returns, funded status reaches about 86% by 2028, while a 6% annual return would take us to almost 80% funding. Charting the path forward means providing a range of plausible results. Similarly, using Pension Outlook, we developed this graphic for our board to show them the impact on employer rates for a typical public agency under alternate scenarios. As most of you are aware, low investment returns, for example, the 5% as shown in yellow here, will lead to quite high employer rates, while much higher returns, for example, the 9% as shown in red, will lead to much lower employer rates. Again, looking forward, we would expect rates to range somewhere between the middle 3 lines on each of these graphs. Okay, shifting gears here, we're going to look at results from Pension Outlook from the perspective of a finance director for a public agency. Currently, this agency must have a non-pooled plan, as the Outlook tool for pool plans is under development and not available until later this summer. So this finance director has logged into my CalPERS and has selected the pension outlook button and then chosen her miscellaneous plan. After a disclaimer page pops up clarifying that CalPERS is not responsible nor endorses that users create, and the user hits accept, what you see here is what comes up initially and represents the baseline view under the Summary tab. The blue line with the scale on the left gives us the funded status of the plan, roughly 67% at the June 30th, 2018 valuation date, and you can see it increases nicely to 100% over the next 25 years. The red line with the scale on the right gives us the employer rate, starting with the rate from the valuation for fiscal year 2021. Increasing for a few years due to ramping of the amortization basis, and then reducing over time as the UAL bases get paid off and the normal cost drops due to the transition to more PEPRA members. Now, the tables to the right of the graph give us some information about the assumptions underlying the projection shown. In this case, this is the baseline. So our base assumptions are the 7% return, 2.75% payroll growth, and 2.5% inflation. The investment scenario chosen, you see on the far right, where we have 7% for the full period. We describe the PEPRA transition details, the default being a 15-year transition from Classic to PEPRA, and if ADPs have been reflected. And there are some additional cost diagnostics related to the scenario chosen. I want to highlight a key couple pieces of information on this graph. The second box on the far right tells us the total cost to this agency for this plan over the next 30 years will be about $130 million. That includes normal costs and all UAL payments. The third box on the far right gives us a quick view of the projected funded status at the end of 3, 5, and 10 years. Finally, the last box on the left provides some info on the employer rates, comparing the current rate to the projected rate for the next fiscal year, as well as providing the average employer rate over the next 30 years and the maximum rate this agency would encounter over the next 30 years. You will also notice tabs just above the graph that provide additional plan information. So right above the graph, you'll see the funding tab. This will give you a projection of the accrued liabilities, the plan assets, and the unfunded accrued liability over the next 30 years. There is a cash flow tab. This gives projections of the benefit payments and the total plan contributions, including employee and employer on an annual basis. And then further to the right, you'll see the budget tab, which we will show later, that provides the fiscal year costs over the next 8 years for budgeting purposes. So that is what you see initially as the baseline view. But this finance director is also very astute and is worried about the downside risk in her plan and its potential impact on her budget. She has clicked on the Modeling Assumptions tab, which you'll see just above the Summary tab, and has entered an alternate scenario. First, she heard that CalPERS returned 6.7% for the year following the valuation date. So she has entered 6.7% into the first year. Then she is also interested in the impact on her plan if returns for the balance of the 10-year period are below expectations. So she enters a 6% return for 9 years and then hits submit. And this is what will pop up on her graph. So the baselines, the solid lines you see here, remain on the graph, but new dotted lines appear showing the revised funding status, being the lower blue line, and employer rates. So the dotted employer rate line, which has increased. So these increases are due to her chosen scenario. Again, the tables to the far right show the investment scenario chosen. So far right, you'll see 6.7 for 1 year, 6% for 9 years, and 7% for the balance of the period. Looking below that, you'll see that the cost impact of the plan, additional cost of $24 million over the next 30 years, an increase of over 18% under her downside risk scenario. Funding progress has reduced, dropping from 88% in 10 years under the baseline to 82% under this scenario. Finally, the bottom box on the left shows an increase in the average rate over 30 years to 26.2%, 3.66% increase over the baseline, and then a new maximum rate of 38.96%, which is 1.8% higher than the baseline. Similarly now, this finance director uses Pension Outlook to map out the impact of various investment scenarios and downloads that information into Excel to create these simple graphs to illustrate the funded ratio progression and possible employer rate impacts for her city council. Now, under her investment scenarios ranging from 5% to 9% over the next 10 years. So you can see the disparity of results between a 5% return, taking us to 74% funded, and a 9% return, which takes us to 100% funded in 9 years. Again, she's trying to educate her board as to the range of possible results. To the right, again, high returns will generate lower rates, the bottom line being our lower costs. A 5% return is going to generate much higher costs, and that's the top line that she's generated there. So I mentioned earlier that there was a budget tab, so we will now take a look at the information available on that tab. Here we see the budget screen of the same scenario considered by our finance director earlier. Now, I admit there's a lot of numbers on this graph, on this chart, and again, all of them are downloadable into Excel for your use. But in this view, we are provided with the following. So line 1 shows us the projected payroll based on our 2.75% payroll growth. Line 2 shows us the normal cost and UAL payment and employer rate by year under the baseline forecast. So the baseline is always shown here. Third, we show the normal cost, UAL payment, and employer rate by year under the chosen scenario. So that follows right below the baseline. And then you can see the difference is the impact on cost. So the impact on their budget in terms of total increase or decrease in cost relative to the baseline forecast, and the change in the total employer rate. Just want to point out that if you have 2 or more non-pool plans, the budget page will combine all your non-pool plans together to show the total cost for your agency. Some plans I know have 3 non-pool plans, so it will combine all 3 of your plans into a total. And again, I just want to point out that there is a download button at the bottom of this tab that will allow you to import all of the results for the baseline and the scenario chosen into Excel. To the right of the fiscal year cost, you will see that there's an annual relative increase in cost. And again, this is just a comparison year over year, both as a percentage and then a difference overall based on the scenario versus your baseline. So this finance director used the budget tab on Pension Outlook to download the annual budget costs into Excel to create these graphs showing the potential impact of investment returns and their timing on their annual budget. Slight increases going forward, and then the impact with the delay in the investment return impacts being smooth, slowly increasing the rates or decreasing the rates depending on the investment scenario chosen. The graph to the right is just a differential comparing what the baseline would have them pay, being the blue line in the middle at 0 increase, to as high as $2 million impact for this plan at the end of this 8-year period, or a potential savings of $2 million with good investment returns. On this graph, the finance director has lowered the discount rate on the modeling assumptions tab to 6.75% and 6.5%. And then using the budget tab has downloaded the annual budget costs into Excel to create these graphs, showing the potential impact of discount rate changes due to either changes in the capital market assumptions or possible portfolio allocation changes contemplated by the CalPERS board. And again, this is just a heads up of what may happen in the future, and this finance director wants to be prepared with a proper analysis in advance. And finally, the finance director has considered making additional discretionary payments, or ADPs, to the plan to see the potential savings to the plan. They will select yes on the modeling assumptions tab on the ADP box, and then enter the amount of the annual ADP in millions, and then the number of years they would like to make that payment for, and then hit submit. This graph of the downloaded info from the budget tab provides the following scenarios. First, a one-time ADP of $1 million, which is the red line, with total plan savings of $1.22 million. The second line, the green line, is an ADP of $1 million for each of the next 5 years, and that has total plan savings of $6.12 million. The graph on the far right shows the annual budget savings due to these additional payments. Note that these ADPs are assumed to be applied to the amortization base with the longest payment period and are assumed to be made equally between your miscellaneous and safety plans. I would note here that the Actuarial Office has created an ADP spreadsheet that provides for greater flexibility in varying amounts and the basis to be applied to. So if you're interested in modeling ADPs, please contact your plan actuary for this spreadsheet. So with that, we are going to turn it back to Randy to see what questions have come in concerning pension outlook.
Great, thanks, Gary. So we have a number of good questions. A lot of them center around the current availability of the tool for our various agencies and stakeholders out across the state. So first of all, you mentioned in the presentation that it's currently available for employers with non-pooled plans, and that we are working on making it available for pooled plans. Can you talk a little bit about why it was a little bit more straightforward to get the tool working for non-pooled plans? We certainly don't want our pooled plan agencies to think we placed any lower priority on having the tool for them, but there are just some considerations as to why it's a little bit more challenging for pooled plans.
Sure, good question. Again, we are working on the pool plan version. Our expectation is available later this summer. And I should also point out at this point that we're also looking to create a version for a public website that is slated to be available in June. So that'll be available to anybody within California to go and look at any particular plan, be it a member, media, labor group, for example. But addressing the complications with the pooled version, as those with pool plans know, we could have a tier 1, a tier 2, and a pepper plan, which are all 3 independent plans. Our task then is to try and combine those, because we know that the first 2 plans are in fact closed, and the payroll is grading off for those 2 plans, and everyone is now joining your pepper plan. So the pepper plan payroll should be, say, skyrocketing, but it will be increasing dramatically over the next 3 to 5 years as a lot of your classic members begin to retire. So the task is to try and pull those three plans together into one cohesive plan and give you some numbers that are appropriate in terms of a funded status and employer rate based on the total payroll of all of your all your pool plans combined. So that is the challenge. I think we're up to the challenge, and we, as I said, we have a prototype in place, and we're trying to get that onto our system for testing purposes, just because pool plans are much more complex in dealing with.
Great, and as a follow-up to that, I'm having a few folks type in a comment that they're attempting to access the tool. They see where to get into it, but they're getting a message that says this information is not available. Is that maybe because they have pooled plans, or they don't have access granted to that section of my CalPERS, or what would be the reason for seeing that message?
That message should pop up if they have a pool plan. And we do have some agencies that will have a pooled safety plan and a non-pooled miscellaneous. It should be pulling in the the non-pooled miscellaneous information, but not having access to the pooled plan in that situation. If you have no non-pooled plans, then you'll, as you say, get that blank page popping up that it's not currently available. And again, we are working to rectify that situation later this summer.
Great. Okay, so we have some folks also on the line today that represent our school districts around the state. Can you talk about the differences in using the tool for those folks, for example, with regard to ADPs versus a public agency?
Yes, we do have a version, obviously, for the schools pool. Schools plan, obviously, are a little bit different in terms of an ADP, in that the employer, being the government, the state, has not typically made contributions until the current year. So we're seeing that for the first time, and we have the ability within the PERF to adjust for those ADPs being made to the schools plan. But on an individual level, we're not showing any, I don't think we're going to be showing any ADPs for the schools version. I don't think school districts are making additional payments to their plans.
Right, so an individual school district couldn't make an additional payment and have their subsequent contribution rate be reduced from everybody else in the school's pool.
That is correct.
Okay, so a number of the slides graph and refer to what we call the employer contribution rate. Can you just explain exactly what that is? A few years ago, we changed how we presented required contributions in our reports, and we show it in two pieces, a normal cost and a payment towards unfunded liabilities. So when the user is seeing something referred to as employer rate, how is that calculated?
Okay, so your employer rate, as Randy says, is made up of a normal cost rate, plus we're taking that UAL dollar payment that we will charge and dividing it in by the projected payroll for that year. So your normal cost rate plus this implied UAL rate are added together to come up with this employer rate as we go forward. What else were you?
Yeah, no, I think that answers it. Thanks. So another thing you mentioned during the presentation, you just referred to a Section 115 trust account that would be available to our participating agencies. Can you talk a little bit about, first of all, just briefly describe what that is and how you would use this tool to maybe plan for whether you think you should utilize a 115 trust, whether that would be something that would perhaps mitigate some risk down the line for you.
Sure. Okay, so a Section 115 trust is another pension that an agency can set up, almost like a rainy day fund, to put money aside that are invested that can be used to make payments towards the pension plan in the future. What we see a lot of these 115 trusts being used is almost like a rate stabilization account. So as you've seen in the pension outlook tool in our presentation, that we know rates are going up significantly in the next 2 to 3 years. So cities are starting to put a little bit of money aside to offset some of those increased costs in the years to come. So what this tool can be used for is to say, we know what our expected costs are under the baseline, but we want to build in a margin. If we think interest rates may be a little bit lower, and you could say it's maybe a 5% or a 4% return in the years to come, was going to put some additional strain on your budgets. You may want to figure out what that difference is under that scenario and maybe budget 2 or 3 years of those additional costs to set aside in this rainy day fund, the 115 trust. So again, how much money you want to put aside into the 115 trust. This tool can kind of give you an idea of what potential costs may be. Maybe there's a discount rate on the horizon. You want to kind of put a little bit of money aside to offset some of those additional costs that may arise that you may not plan for. For me as an actuary, I see the 115 trust as being very valuable for those agencies that don't have stable revenues. And they're a little bit worried that if in a couple of bad years of revenue, they don't have the funds necessary to meet their required contribution. They would then dip into their 115 trust and use some of that money to make those payments. If you've got fairly stable revenue growth and you're not worried about that, you may be more interested in making an ADP and paying down some of these UALs and getting direct savings through your plan.
Great. So one of our listeners, I think maybe missed the slide that indicated exactly where you would enter an additional discretionary payment. I don't know if we can go back on our slides and show on the input screen exactly how that would be done.
Yeah, unfortunately, we didn't pull up the modeling assumptions tab. Let me see if we can. Where is our? So if you look at this one, there's this modeling assumptions. If you click on the modeling assumptions, you'll get a drop down of all the parameters that you can change. For example, the investment returns, the discount rates, and there's an ADP box in there as well. You will have a drop down when you say yes to the ADP, and it will tell you what effectively 1% of your UAL is for that plan. And then you'll be able to enter any specific amount that you want as an ADP. Again, they're in millions, so if you want to put in 100,000, you're going to put 0.1. And I do caution that those amounts, if you have 2 plans, a similar amount is going to be put into both plans, your safety and your miscellaneous, when you go to your budget tab. So we have had a question come in already that said, if I want to put $2 million to my safety and nothing into my miscellaneous, I would run a scenario putting in my $2 million as an ADP to the safety plan, download that information into Excel, and then go back and put 0 in for my miscellaneous plan, download that information, and then do a little quick cut and paste in Excel to add up the total combined cost for that plan. We should also point out that this is the first version of Pension Outlook, and we are looking for your comments and ideas for enhancement, that if that's significant, we can try and adjust those amounts per plan in the next version. So any ideas that you may have to improve the tool or things that you would like to see added would be helpful to us as we strive to improve this tool for your use.
That's a great point. And in fact, one of our listeners was asking about a potential future enhancement to allow modeling changes to either inflation or payroll growth. And we've heard that in some of our other sessions with the tool. That is something that we're looking at. There's always a balance of being able to make the tool simple to use and understandable versus throwing in all the bells and whistles that we can. So we are looking at that. Obviously, getting it ready for pooled plans is our top priority right now. One of our listeners was asking if it's free to use, and the answer is yes. Everything we do out of the Actuarial Office is free. Another question, Carrie. One of our listeners has a question about, I guess, the interaction between the discount rate assumption that the user can model versus the investment scenario that they can also model independently. So can you just talk about the difference between those two input items and their relationship?
Yeah, ideally, if we're, I mean, as actuaries, if we're looking long-term, our discount rate would be equal to our investment rate. But we wanted to build in some flexibility here. We know that we can set a discount rate of 7 and earn, I mean, in the current year, we're at over 7% year to date, that there are going to be good years and going to be some bad years on the investment horizon. So you can model a specific discount rate and have a different investment return. So we can model a 7% discount rate, but assume that we're earning 6.5 for the next 30 years, just to see the impact of those small losses every year and how they add up and affect your rates going forward. On the flip side, we could model a lower discount rate, the 6.75, but leave investment returns at 7, because we're not quite sure how the future will play out. And these are just possible scenarios that you may want to reflect. But back to Randy's point, I think it's key that you kind of keep your discount rate and your investment scenarios fairly close. It wouldn't make sense to assume a 6% discount rate and then model an 8% return over the next 30 years. The other thing that Randy did mention is that we are looking to build in a little bit more in terms of sensitivity, that we will be adjusting based on the 19 valuations that we're working on now, the ability to lower the inflation rate and payroll growth. So if you believe that the 2.5 inflation is high, you may want to model 2 or 2.25 and have the payroll growth and the discount rate aligned with that as well to see the impact of lower inflationary world going forward. So we're trying to build in a little bit more flexibility in the next version. The first version was meant to be fairly simplistic, get people comfortable with using the tool, and then trying to expand on it as we go forward.
Great. Lots of good questions, by the way. Keep them coming. We do have some time left in our hour here. Another question, Carrie. One of our listeners is wondering how they should choose the period over which to reflect the PEPRA transition. Is there something in their report or some information that they could use to maybe select what seems to be the most appropriate period for them?
Another great question. We do review transition from Classic to PEPRA. We're seeing typically a 5 to 6% per year turnover. And then now this varies by plan. So we're seeing slightly less for safety plans, maybe slightly more for miscellaneous plans. I do have some plans that are over 50% PEPRA already at the June 2018 valuation date. So what we were trying to do is to model as the default the 15 years, but give you the ability to change that. If you think your transition to PEPRA is moving along much slower, I would suggest putting in a 20-year transition, which is going to delay the savings on the normal cost. On the other hand, if you're seeing a lot more PEPRA showing up in your plan, you may want to accelerate it and show a 10-year transition. Appendix D2 of your report will provide you with some of the information in terms of head counts within your plan on the valuation date. But I'm sure your HR people will give you a much more current estimate of how quickly things are turning over on your plans.
Okay, great. Another question with regard to an ADP. And again, this goes to maybe future enhancements. The listener is wondering, will there be future ability to specify the number of years and then be able to enter a specific ADP amount for each of those years?
That's a good question. Again, first version, we're trying to keep things fairly simple. I know if you're going to make an extra ADP, we've kept it the same amount. There has been some thought to building out a little bit more information there that says I can put a different amount by year. Our challenge, obviously, is there's infinite possibilities of what your ADPs may be and how they're being applied. Are they going to your long-term base, your short-term base? And at this point, at least, we feel that the ADP spreadsheet the Actuarial Office developed is a much better tool for modeling some of that, some of those choices and some of those impacts. And we're in fact looking to make a little extra enhancement to that tool, where you can actually model some of the funded status. So you can see funded status progress on that tool as we look to improve that tool as well. But that's a good question. Again, it's just a matter of balancing simplicity in using the tool versus how much flexibility we want to provide in terms of varying amounts, varying the basis, and then the period involved. It just gets a little bit unwieldy.
Great. We have another question here about the types of scenarios that you can run with the tool. And I think this gets to the point of some of your graphs, I believe, were a result of running multiple scenarios, downloading the information, and then separately creating those charts. But can you just discuss, for example, one scenario for the Pension Outlook tool? You can actually vary more than one assumption, but just talk to, I guess, how you would get these multiple scenarios and these additional charts that don't come right out of the tool that can be created from the tool.
Yeah, that's a good question. Again, the tool is set up mainly to compare to a baseline forecast. So here's the baseline from our report, and here's an alternate scenario. And finance directors are going to come up with all kinds of interesting alternate scenarios that they want to compare for whatever reason. They're trying to educate their city council, educate their city manager, or to do some analytical work in terms of maybe, how much do we need to put into a Section 115, or what are the benefits of making an ADP? How much are we going to save? So trying to run multiple scenarios on a graph within this tool, we could think about doing it as an enhancement. It just means storing a lot more specific information per scenario. And that was one of the reasons we said, let's just allow you to download all that information from that scenario and store it. Because if you want to combine 3 different scenarios at your end, you would just basically pull those 3 scenarios together into an Excel spreadsheet and do your graphics yourself. So we wanted to give you the numbers and the background information to be able to produce your own graphics and your own analysis using the information that you're driving.
A lot of questions regarding additional discretionary payments, which is a good sign. It's nice to know that a lot of our employers are, if they have the financial means, looking into making these payments, since it does increase the funded status of the plans, and in the long run does save money. So another question here, you mentioned that there's a different spreadsheet, an ADP spreadsheet, that agencies can use for, I guess, more specific modeling of ADPs that might be a little bit more detail-oriented than Pension Outlook. Can you talk about how an agency acquires one of those?
Great question. The easiest way is to contact your plan actuary. Look at your valuation report, and whoever signed your report, not Scott Tarando, our chief, but the next signature you see, that is the individual to contact. Or if you want to send an email, and we'll show you the link at the end, Stakeholder Relations has a box that they can forward as well. So you can email to that, and we will get your request to the plan actuary. It's usually a fairly quick turnaround time at our end, a day or 2 to get the ADP spreadsheet put together. It is available for each one of your plans. So we've had a lot of good feedback from people using the tool. And I would encourage, if you're even thinking about making ADP, to look at this tool and play with it a little bit to see the potential savings and the impact to future UAL payments using that tool.
Okay, an interesting question that maybe Carrie and I both might have some thoughts on. This question says, our agency has always used 80% as a targeted funded status for our pension plan. Do you have a recommended target for your agencies? Is there any concern over overfunding if we target a 90% funded status? So first of all, I'm going to let Kerry give his thoughts, and I will give mine as well. This is a really difficult question. We get asked this all the time. Even if you got a room of 10 actuaries together, they might all have different thoughts, different ideas. So Kerry and I will give our personal opinions, not necessarily the opinions of CalPERS. But go ahead, Kerry.
I'll give you my opinion, and then Randy will give you the correct opinion afterwards. But we do get this question a fair bit from our agencies. Personally, I think the 90% range is what I think of as the comfort zone. I would make an ADP up to 90%, because the last thing you want to do is make an additional payment and have a really good year in the market and you blow way past 100%. Not that that's a bad thing to be over 100% funded, but you can't get the money back. The money is now in the fund, and yes, it's a margin and a cushion in there against future losses. But I'd be more inclined to take your plan up to, say, 90% and then make slow payments. In the event that you do get a good year, you may go from 90 to 100 in a year in the future without having to make an additional payment. So again, my personal opinion, I feel more comfortable taking you up to about a 90% target and then just kind of riding that forward on a year-by-year basis. But Randy will give you the correct opinion there.
Well, no, not at all, but I'll give you my personal opinion, certainly. So the 80% targeted funded status is something you see quite often in the media, not necessarily from actuaries. I don't know how, but it's sort of become a accepted, funded status for a plan. I would really caution people from using that percentage or any percentage other than 100% as something that you're completely satisfied with or comfortable with. The target is always 100%, I believe. Let's remember, this isn't a funded status of what you might owe to people in the future or for benefits that will accrue in the future. This is a funded status of the amount of assets you have with regard to service accrued through the valuation date. Those benefits should be 100% funded. That doesn't mean it's easy to get there, and a lot of our agencies and plans across the country are not 100% funded. But I would say the target is 100. I agree with Kerry. There may be considerations when you're talking something between 90 and 100%. But if one of my agencies said I'd like to make us 100% funded, I probably wouldn't send the money back. So those are my thoughts. That's a great question. Let's see what else we have in the couple minutes we have left. Another interesting question. One of our listeners is wondering if an ADP is equally as effective for pooled plans as compared to non-pooled plans.
Yes, definitely. Under the old pooling structure, obviously it wasn't encouraged for plans to put money in because it was just going into the pool. But since 2013, we've changed that, and that any additional amounts that a pool plan puts in is applied directly to their account and pays off their own specific UAL. So I would encourage any pool plan, if they can, again, subject to their budgetary constraints, to make ADPs, because there is significant savings when you're paying down the 7% loan.
Great. I think with that, I'm just going to make a few follow comments and call it a day. There are some additional questions about whether there will be a recording of the webinar. There will. I'm not entirely sure where you will find it, but it will be on YouTube somewhere, and I presume there'll be some information available to you to make it easy for you to find. We've answered a lot of the questions that came in during the webinar. There are a few still here that, if there are straightforward answers, we will look at them and try to get back to the folks that submitted them. So with that, I just want to thank everybody for participating. You can also, Kerry mentioned, you can always contact your actuary if you need help using the tool. Sometimes you don't know who your actuary is, and so in those cases, you can always contact our stakeholder relations folks with the web address shown on the slide here. They will eventually get to an actuary, regardless of how they come in. So again, I want to thank Kerry for all of his hard work on this tool and for a great webinar. And Yes, thank you. I was reminded that we will email the PowerPoint presentation. Some folks missed that information at the beginning of the webinar as well as the user manual. So that will be coming out to you sometime this week. So look for that. And with that, I will call it a day, and everybody have a great day. Thank you.